My name is Jeff Ritter. I'm the town administrator, and I welcome everyone here tonight to this listening session. And for anybody who is here for Mommy and me, you're in the wrong place. Right?
Wrong time.
Yes. Thank you very much for the Park and Rec for making the space available to us to have this discussion about climate change. And I'm particularly excited about this because this is a topic that's kind of close to my heart, and I think that it's something that's going to evolve over the next, obviously, several years and probably generations to come. So just so everyone understands how we got to where we are today, there was a grant opportunity through the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness program, and we applied for the grant. We got the grant, and we were able to engage the services of Kim Lundgren and her associates to go through a series of exercises. And the first exercise was to pull together a core team, which we did. And then we had a second exercise where we identified with the core team and others who were present at that meeting in this room some of the vulnerability areas in town. For instance, drought, floods, forest fires, etc. So we went through all that exercise, and the final step of the grant is to have a listening session from the public, and that's what we're here for tonight. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kara.
Great.
And thank you very much for being here.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff, for that great introduction. And it sounds like we've got a lot of experience in this room with Holliston, so that's great. Thank you all for being here tonight. As Jeff said, my name's Kara. I also work at Kim Lundgren Associates, and so we're the consultant team that's been kind of leading the town of Holliston along this process. So we're really excited to be here. So let's just talk quickly about our agenda for the night. So we just had our welcome, and I'm going to be doing a presentation about the MVP process that Jeff just talked a little bit about, and then also what community resilience means in Holliston, and some about the climate change hazards, including what Jeff kind of alluded to that we talked about at the workshops that many of you were in attendance at a few weeks ago. And then the main portion of the night is actually going to be more of an informal session where you all are going to be helping us kind of brainstorm some of your concerns and some actions that we can take together as a community. So you'll see there's some stations set up in the back of the room, and I'll explain a little bit more about how that works when we get there. So that is what we'll do tonight. So in terms of objectives, we want to introduce you all to some of the climate-related hazards that we might be experiencing more in the future. We want to review solutions that were identified through these MVP workshops that we talked about a little bit earlier, and then also understand which hazards the community is concerned about as a whole, and identify actions to enhance resiliency. So the MVP process, Jeff gave a pretty good introduction to that already, but it's really, it's a grant program that's run by the state of Massachusetts that is really focused on opening the conversation about climate change and preparing for the impacts of climate change in all of the municipalities in Massachusetts. So this is actually the planning grant stage of that process. Which is a very prescribed process. As Jeff mentioned, we have the core team meeting of some key municipal officials that happened a couple months ago. And then we had these 2 4-hour workshops with a diverse set of stakeholders representing different sectors within the town. And then this is sort of the final part of that planning grant portion of the process where we get more community input, which is really exciting. So once we're done with the meeting here tonight, we're going to be wrapping everything into a report that we'll submit to the state And once we do that, you guys will be an MVP certified community, which basically means that you then have access to more grant funding to actually implement some of the actions that were identified through this process. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But can I just get a show of hands of who is on the core team or attended one of the MVP workshops? So these will all be your resources tonight as well. They've got a wealth of knowledge about what's been going on and the different things that we've already talked about in terms of actions and things like that, which I'll also be telling you a little bit more about in this presentation. So first, let's take a step back and just talk about what resilience in Holliston means. So resilience as a term is really about surviving and thriving no matter what the challenge is. And so when we're talking about this, we're not only talking about resilience to acute shocks like hurricanes, like heat waves, things that you often find associated with climate change, but we're also talking about resilience in relation to some of the chronic stressors that really impact our community members, some of our community members on a day-to-day basis. And those are the types of things that might actually get worse once we add on some of these additional climate impacts. So it's really important to address sort of both sides of that coin in terms of resilience. So some of the chronic stressors that we're talking about include financial stressors, for example, feeling like you're not making enough money for yourself or your family, social stressors, feeling unsafe or feeling alone, isolated, health stressors, feeling like you can't put your best foot forward because of some sort of physical or mental health issue, and then environmental stressors can be related to things that are lessening your quality of life, like water quality or air pollution or things like that. So in addition to addressing chronic stressors, we do, of course, also want to address some of these acute shocks that might become more exacerbated or might become more intense in the future. So when we met with the core team and we met with the MVP stakeholders during those workshops, we identified 4 main hazards that the town of Holliston is concerned about moving into the future. And those are the 4 that we're going to focus on tonight and that are represented by the different stations in the back of the room. So the 4 that we identified were intense storms, flooding, drought, and extreme heat. And I just want to note here that oftentimes we hear on the news like, oh, that hurricane was caused by climate change. But I just want to say that it's important to note that like one extreme event doesn't necessarily mean it was caused by climate change. Climate change is more about the trends, the accumulations of those weather over time, and that's what's those weather patterns over time, which is what is actually climate change, not just one weather event. So we'll talk a little bit more about those trends in these coming slides. So the first one I want to talk about is intense storms. And when we're talking about intense storms, we're not just talking about rain, but we're also talking about wind, we're talking about ice, we're talking about snow. So this category kind of encompasses all of those types of extreme weather events. And you'll see here that there's actually been a 70% increase in the amount of precipitation falling during very heavy rain events from 1958 to 2010. And the Northeast is actually ranked number 1 in terms of all of the regions in the US for how much this has been increasing. And then when we think about the types of things we might expect more in the future, we all remember those 4 nor'easters in 3 weeks last year, right? So, you know, those types of events occurring more and more often is what we really want to be able to be prepared for as a town. So this is a graph that's just showing that if you took the average frequency of the heaviest downpours from 1950 to 2010, those years after the 1980s were mostly greater than that average. So it's just showing this trend toward more precipitation, like the title, when it rains, it pours. So these storms are becoming more and more frequent. And then this graph is showing hurricanes. So you can see from about sort of the same break point, this is after sort of the 90s, there's been this increase in the number of hurricanes that we're seeing, and also not just the overall number, but also the number of Category 3 plus hurricanes, so more intense hurricanes. So when we met with the MVP stakeholders during the workshops, we talked about, as Jeff said, all of these different hazards, and then also, what our concerns were, but also what kinds of actions we'd want to take. But I'm just going to talk about some of the impacts that the stakeholders at the meeting highlighted when they were talking about intense storms. So this is just a sampling. We talked about a lot of different things, but one of them was storm impact on critical facilities, power and utilities, and communications. People were also concerned about stormwater runoff, polluting natural features, and then school and business closures we know can happen with intense storms impacting our economy here in town. So those are just some of the types of impacts that we might see. So then moving on to flooding, this slide also kind of shows some of that economic impact that some of this might have as we move into the future. So there was actually $35.2 million in damage from 2 floods in March 2010. That was for the whole of Middlesex County. So this is some data from your hazard mitigation plan here in town. So we can be expecting more impacts from flooding. Obviously, that goes hand in hand with intense storms. And then some of the impacts that we talked about during the MVP workshops. These are just 2 of them that were highlighted a lot during those workshops. One was the aging water distribution system here in town, and people being concerned that that system might not be able to handle sort of some of this extra capacity it'll need in the future due to some more intense storms and flooding. And then there was also a lot of talk about the dams here in town. And we know a lot of them are at sort of a high hazard risk of failing. And so thinking about how to mitigate some of that will be important in the future, especially in relation to climate change. So then here's drought. So some people might be kind of interested in why we're talking about drought when we're also talking about more storms and water in general. But the reason that we're talking about drought is actually because while precipitation is expected to increase overall, during the summer there's actually projected to be a little bit of a decline in precipitation, and that combined with some of this hotter temperature that we're seeing is what really allows drought to happen. So in October 2016, some of you may remember, that was a time that actually 52% of the Massachusetts land area was in exceptional drought, which is the highest classification of drought. And so that's the type of thing we might see more in the future in Holliston. We heard from stakeholders that that drought did impact people here in town. And we know that Holliston relies on groundwater as your drinking water source. And so thinking about that in relation to drought, definitely an impact there. So in addition to talking about impacts to drinking water supply at the workshop, we also talked about the increased risk of brush fires. I'm sure the chief would be happy to chat with you more about that. And then also the deteriorating health of wetlands that can happen through drought as well. So drought can impact some of our natural features as well and how well they can provide their services to us. And then finally, we have heat waves. So the data at the bottom here is actually showing that from 1971 to 2000, the average number of days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit was 8. By mid-century, it could be as many as 30, and by the end of the century, it could be more like 46. So that's obviously well over a month of weather over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a significant departure from our New England climate. And you'll see on the opposite side of the coin that there will be fewer days that are below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And this map is showing what may happen to the climate of Massachusetts over that time. We've already moved down in climate to around, that New York, New Jersey kind of area. And by the end of the century, if we don't cut our greenhouse gas emissions significantly, we might be feeling more like South Carolina here in Massachusetts. So some of the impacts that we talked about at the stakeholder workshop were things like a lot of places in town lacking air conditioning, as is the case for a lot of places in Massachusetts. And people being exposed to heat for long periods of time can lead to heat-related illness, can lead to decreased productivity in schools when kids are distracted by hot weather and things like that. And then also, when we think about heat, we also might be seeing sort of a more favorable climate for some of the invasive species that can come and kind of take over some of our native species in town. So that was another topic of conversation. So those are all of the impacts, and just a little bit about them. And I wanted to note, because I heard a lot of you talk about reducing our personal impact and collective impact to contributing to climate change. So that's also obviously definitely important. What we're focusing on in this part of the MVP process is the preparedness side of things, but that obviously goes hand in hand with also reducing greenhouse gases. So just in case anyone needs a little bit of a refresher on greenhouse gases, when we drive our vehicles that are powered by gas and diesel, and when we use electricity in our homes that's powered by fossil fuels, that releases these things called greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And while actually there are greenhouse gases that are naturally occurring that make our Earth kind of habitable for us, ever since the Industrial Revolution, we've been adding more and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. It's really building up that layer around the Earth, which is leading to these increases in global warming, and then also all of this changing climate and all of these crazy weather patterns that we're seeing. So that is a little bit about sort of the mitigation side of things. So while the MVP process is really focused on preparedness on this stage, when we can access those action grants after we submit our report after this, that's when we can also start thinking a little bit about the mitigation side of things and how we reduce our carbon footprint. So the town is actually going to pursue funding for a climate action plan through that grant process that would have actions for both preparedness and reducing greenhouse gases together in that. So that's an exciting prospect for the future, and maybe we'll have you all back here to work on that planning process as well, which would be really exciting. So now I just want to talk a little bit about some of the top actions that came out of the MVP workshops. So we kind of brainstormed all of our actions, and then we all prioritized which ones we thought would be the most impactful, the most important for Holliston. And we talked about it in relation to 3 different areas. So Holliston's infrastructure, social and economic systems, and environmental systems. So under infrastructure, the 2 top actions were to assess which dams are best suited for removal and ecological restoration. So we know some dams in Holliston have really outlived their original purpose, and you can actually have a controlled removal of those dams, and so that you can restore sort of the habitat around there and lessen the problem of it failing and having more flooding throughout town. So looking at that was a top priority. Also accelerating the replacement of the aging water distribution system that I talked about before that people were concerned about. In terms of social and economic, installing more air conditioning in schools was seen as a priority. We know that some of the administrative offices at the schools have air conditioning, but a lot of the classrooms do not. And so there was a thought that we might want to put more of that in there. Expanding and updating current emergency shelters to make sure that we're ready for any significant events that may occur. Launching a community-wide preparedness program so that people are more understanding of what to do in case of an emergency and have resources to shelter in place if needed and things like that. And then in terms of environmental, we talked about protecting the water supply through zoning and perhaps incentivizing people to hook up to the municipal system instead of having their own wells that they can draw from. And then creating a forest management plan that's related to things like how to control brush fires and invasives and just general maintenance. And then finally, partnering with the state to address the beaver problem that we heard about in town. So what's next? So we're here, obviously, to gather your input tonight. I mentioned we're going to submit that MVP report to the state once we wrap this all up. We'll have ongoing communication and outreach and collaboration with you all, and then we really want to prepare for those MVP action grants. So I mentioned that climate action plan potentially being one of those, and so we'll be looking to apply for more funding from the state for that. And in terms of when you're going around to the different stations tonight, one of the things that the state really emphasizes and wants to give more funding for is what's called a nature-based solution, where you're really leveraging nature and working with nature to kind of lessen some of the impacts from some of these climate change hazards that we're talking about. So these are different kinds of nature-based solutions. Open space preservation, you can think of that actually like the town forest plan might actually kind of go with that type of thing, but preserving some of our natural features to help us mitigate some impacts from climate change. Ecosystem restoration, that dam removal process and restoring the natural systems there is actually related to that. That might be a good one to fit into that category. And low impact development, we can think of things like requiring green infrastructure, for example, in new development, things like that, that might fit into that category. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, so this part of the MVP process is really focused on preparedness, and that's what the state is requiring in order to be a certified community. So that's what we're focusing on here tonight. But when we apply for that action grant stage, so once we finish this current process and move to that additional funding that we're going to apply for, that's when we can start folding in some of that reducing our carbon footprint actions.
I have a related question, which is just might we think about things that have, what's the word I want, double impact. For example, if we are going to install air conditioning in schools, could we link that with putting solar electricity in the schools so that could power the air conditioning?
Exactly.
So we won't be making our problem worse while we try to mitigate it.
Yep.
And I wonder if there aren't other. I mean, you haven't there was this sort of talk about infrastructure in terms of water systems. I think a lot about disruptions to power coming into town, disruptions to natural gas supplies or to electricity supplies,
yep.
And to whatever extent we can, is our steps that we might take to create kind of a local electrical grid, with those kind of things be both mitigating and reducing greenhouse gas emissions simultaneously, and might we think in those terms?
Definitely, yes. And that kind of overlap is exactly the kind of thing that we'd want to think about more, and that can totally go into this part of the process as well as the next part.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that maybe we haven't mentioned is the toxins and the, for example, the glyphosates, the Roundup, and the nitrogen, the high nitrogen fertilizers that are going into our lawns and spilling into the lake and causing the lake weed thing, and the neonics, which everybody's planting their pretty little flowers from Walmart, and they're killing the bees. And I really see that as just a serious, immediate hazard for us. That there are pictures of people in trees in China hand pollinating the fruit trees, and the other piece of that is that Midwestern farmers haven't planted yet, and our food is going to be so expensive this summer, So that's a way that the whole green agricultural, how's the health of the land and the soil important, not just in Oklahoma, but also to us.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
I would request that maybe we add consideration of how we're managing our pollution and toxins.
Yeah,
As it
definitely.
relates to food supply, yeah. It's hard.
And health of the lake, and, yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yes, that's great contribution, and I want to make sure that you definitely contribute that on the posters back there as well. That'll be really important to include. Yes.
Maybe just a thought, I mean, realizing this agenda is, like you said, really infrastructure robustness and, working toward that grant. Maybe at the end of the session, we could try to get a grassroots, action going in the town around, some of the mitigation strategies that we can each take, and how could we foster that in the community. Maybe we could take that as an action to just get that sort of going, because I think a lot of the community here is probably interested in that as we work toward this other process that you and others are in the midst of.
Yes, definitely. That sounds great.
I've thought about this a lot.
Yeah.
So the state of Massachusetts is putting in a number of efforts to increase multimodal transportation in the state, meaning buses and bicycles and fixing the red line and some other things like that. And we in Holliston have been in chaos for the past few years, and even more recently about the amount of traffic in town. And we do have some programs in town that are public transportation, but I think it might be good to consider the progress of the city coming out into the suburbs and us becoming more and more populated with developments and traffic as part of what our planning process.
Yeah, definitely. Sounds good. All right. Any other burning questions before we move to the back? Yep.
Yeah, Mark.
Sure.
Again. I'm interested in, one of the things that Holliston has, which is a little unique, is we have at least 2 or 3 operating farms. And
Operating
plus we
Farms.
Also,
Farm.
Farms, yeah.
farms,
I'm sorry.
And we also have our own town farm that we bought, Soraki Farm. And I'm aware of a new process of agriculture called no-till farming.
Okay.
And that's to promote healthy soils. And healthy soils is defined by a kind of soil that has all different kinds of organisms in it, that is resilient to absorb more water when it rains and retain it longer during drought periods. And so maybe we get our agriculture people look into this no-till type of farming.
Awesome. Great. Yeah, that's another excellent thing that we'll definitely want you to contribute when we get into our informal things as well. All right, I'm going to take one more question and then we'll move to the back of the room. Yep.
I promise it's my last.
No, please.
I just want to commend the town for having small trash barrels come around to our house.
Yes.
And I know that there's been an uproar about it, but thank you, Jeff, and the town. We don't even know where that trash is going necessarily, maybe New Jersey. And so let's watch the situation with our trash and our recycling and composting. Black Earth is bringing composting into the town.